Hello, I'm Diana Pelabak. I'd like to welcome all of you on behalf of the B3 team to our artist talk featuring Norav Shan Mirza and Brett Butler, who are both joining us from London. Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Brett and Nor, they have been co-directing award-winning art film and video works for 23 years. That's quite some time. And at B3, you are showing a truly intriguing art film entitled Ruptures. It was produced in association with and Arts Council England. Just tell us briefly, for starters, how did this project come about?
Maybe I'll leap in on that one then, because I think this project, I know you said briefly, but I'm going to be honest, it's not that easy to do it so briefly. But this project was an idea that I was carrying around for a long time. This film Ruptures is based on a real incident, a car crash. And when I first heard about it, I was very intrigued for two reasons. One was because there was an inherent cinematic quality to the story, the real event itself. And the second was because I was reading a lot of accident theory. Accident theory is something I keen to with a theorist called Paul Virilio. He made a museum of accidents, and he essentially argued that in every technology that is created, you also build an accident into that technology. So if you build an aeroplane, you build the air crash. If you build a car, you build a car crash inside the technology. The two things come together. And he argued that for the creation of a museum of accidents, and he argued that the television itself is this museum of accidents. And this was really interesting me with this particular car crash that we were looking at. And it took a long time for us as a collaboration to agree to make it, because my memory is Noor quite rightly kept saying, within the people in this car.
Well, should I
yeah, maybe it's like handing the baton. Yeah, let's.
All right. No, it's just that like a lot of the way that we work together. Of course, we have different interests and different obsessions, and I always value the things that Brad becomes obsessed about. But sometimes it might be like I have to find my own entry point. So at that point, I was not so interested in the event so much, because it was just like, it was a story that was full of just toxic masculinity, just like a lot of, do you know what I mean? It was just like, I didn't want to work with these characters, these men in the car. And it took a long time before I realized I got interested we could work with the fictionalized story of the woman, the only woman in the car. So that's when I...
Was it a news report that you heard or read about the real car crash? Where did you come across the story?
Historically, so we were making a film called Deep State. This was back in 2010, 11, 12. And when you use that term, which has become quite in the consciousness in sort of Western thought now, even you can see President Trump uses the term deep state. But back then, when you looked at the key countries that had that inside their psychology, Turkey was one of them. I mean, it absolutely exists outside Turkey. It's in England. It's in every country.
Well,
it's in Germany.
It's in the sort of like it's in the modern. So it's almost like within the state, the modern version of any state. There is present a deep state. So it's almost a bit like the accident theory. Within the technology is the inbuilt accident. So within the state, there is the deep state, and the deep state is this unelected forces that is operative on the state itself. So that can be anything from corporate interests to sort of more murkier interests to levels of corruption, but it is these unelected forces and their power on the body of the state.
And so, just to complete the question you asked, in Turkey, this car crash that we ended up inspiring our film is very well known, and it's part of a massive political wave. One could even argue it's as large as, I guess, in our consciousness, the biggest car crash we experienced was Diana dying. I think probably, it's that kind of element where, but in the case in Turkey, it was in the consciousness to such an extent because it was the first time that they could say the deep state exists. It isn't just a kind of philosophical idea.
It gave language to something that was felt. You know how
Yeah.
you can feel something's in the you can feel power, but you can't, or how things are working, but you couldn't give it like a name or a voice.
In the car, it's really the group is quite illustrious and dubious at the same time, right? There's a politician, member of parliament there, a gentleman. The driver is a former police captain, or still is a police officer. I don't quite recall. Then there's to me, at first he seemed like a drug lord, but later it turned out that he was an assassin, a right-wing assassin. And these three are in cahoots together, which is really scary. And the fourth person is a young woman riding in the backseat of the car next to the assassin. And this is the point where you became interested in this story as well, Moravshan, because you thought you saw a way of telling the story from her point of view.
Yeah, I mean, we spoke a lot about if the car, which is a classic Mercedes, like a black, I can't remember what name it is, but it's a car that represents state, represents power. So if the car is the state of the state, we were initially interested in like, well, what were they talking about in the car? And then we realized, well, actually, that's not really interesting. The creative question for us was, if the car is the state of the state, then how do we get out of the car? So how we got out of the car was through fictionalizing Yenge, which is the woman's her journey. So that was for us how we get out of the car, which is the metaphor for like, obviously we need to, to crash patriarchy, to crash capital, to crash all these corrupt forces, But I mean, this is just, it's a way of being able to imagine how we can get out of the state of the state. And so, yeah, it was became a feminist road movie. And that's,
I wanted to ask you about that. In what, it's a road movie because the four of them are riding in a car, they're on a journey. And it's feminist because he.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing with the film. It's chaptered into three parts, even though it as a linear narrative. Like, obviously, it's very different experience, and the narrative works very differently in the installation, in the exhibition. And it's very clear that the voice of the work and the feminist voice is very, very prominent in the installation, partly because the form accommodates a relationship that you actually have to that feminist voice, which includes you more as participant rather than as like an observer. Like when we're in the cinema, we're that relationship between consuming the film places you in this less in a participant position. But back to your point, the voice in this, so it starts off in a way where we had to show the patriarchy. We had to sort of show the sort of toxic masculinity. At the same time, be mindful not to sort of place, we're working with archetypes, but not place them in a way that kind of heroicizes them, but also makes them as kind of ordinary as possible. So as like, it could be your own uncle or your dad, or, it's these characters, these male figures. So we needed to bring that into being. And she, in that first part, she's not a victim of that situation. She is a survivor. So we think of her as a survivor of this toxic masculinity. You can see that she doesn't have any dialogue in the first chapter. There's a couple of references to opening the window, wanting some air. Then the second chapter, you can see that she starts to take up her power. She starts to take up space, not just like through the story. She starts to re-narrate the whole sequence of the first act, if you like. And then by the time we get to the third act, you realize that she's not alone in this rising up, in this taking up space, and not only taking up space, but actually transforming the space, which is where we end up in the space of the gossip, which is the transnational feminist revolutionaries meeting in the space of kinship and community and bonds that are ancestral, long-standing, when women have always organized, women have always held power, women have always been at the front of revolutions. It's just the patriarchy that's written us out of that narrative.
Mm-hmm. You already hinted at the fact that this artwork started out as an installation, correct? And it was called The Scar. And on your website, you saw beautiful pictures of the installation being mounted in a gallery space. And I wish I could experience that. I wish I could go back there, and because it would be interesting to see the difference. It was a 5-channel video installation, and you adapted that to just the flat screen as a cinematic experience. What did you lose by doing that, and what did you possibly gain through this adaptation?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. Actually, the films are quite edited quite differently between the two versions in the end. But what, of course, we gain in the installation, the moment you cross the threshold, the doorway, you enter into a kind of universe of the film. So we're able to sort of expand the film out into objects, into forms, into situations, into occasionally text on the wall. So it also allows you to move freely through the space. And we discovered that people would sometimes be attracted to go to the third part of the film first because it was 3 screens and surrounded you. It was built so that you, with your body, completed the circle with these women that are speaking. So even though we structured it so you find the first screen, the first chapter, as Noor described it, you come to the second one where the female voice is predominant. Then you come to the third. People would choose their own way to read it. And so sometimes they could go 3, 2, 1 or all these different sort of forms and ways. So we cut it slightly differently too. I don't know, you may or may not agree, but we've noticed that with video installations, people decide very quickly if they're going to stay with the film or not. So
it's a big ask, because if you're in the gallery, it's actually asking, I think, 50 minutes of screen time if you stay. And, of course, we sample things. So you might sample, and they were all on continuous loops as well. So, so where you entered, so that kind of relationship to narrative was really broken as well. There's lots of circulations. There was a very different sense of time. And
just to finish my point, so we'd edit that very differently. The installation, I think, is a bit sharper edit. You don't have as much time, in a way, to grab someone's attention and hold them, and they decide they're going to complete a loop. Whereas in the film, there's already a contract, so to speak, in place, with someone who's going to sit in a cinema. The third question you're asking about, how does that also transform out into us watching things on our computers at home? I don't know. That's a sort of third stage I think we'd like to work with in the future as well. As you make a third design for these small desktop situations, maybe. But
well, since we're all being corona'd, you made that verb up earlier. All we have this year at B3 is the computer screen, is the laptop screen. Maybe some people can hook their TV up to the artwork, and that's what we're. Instead of being able to meet in Frankfurt and have experience and enjoy proper installations and proper face-to-face meetings, we're all limited to this. But I was very intrigued by the film, and I watched it, and I especially also enjoyed your actors. I think that it was casted amazingly. The actors you found were brilliant. I don't know how. Maybe you want to talk about how you found them, how you cast them, and how you managed shooting the film in the Turkish language with you not being fluent in it. So.
Yeah, I know, and it was the first time to work on this scale of working with actors, dialogue, scripting. You can see from our previous works, we have a lot of experience, but this was like probably the closest to coming to maybe a more conventional filmmaking. But we drew on a lot of our earlier kind of artist methods or practices. So we workshop a lot of things. We workshop the ideas, but we also workshop performance and the performance elements to the telling of the narrative through the body. But with the actors, we also spent time with workshops, and it is really just, I suppose, the way that Brad and I work together, because we've always in collaboration, so there's always a dialogue. So it's kind of extending that out, and so it means that we can go deeper. Like, we've got a lot of tools, really. We've done theatre of the oppressed workshops for years, so we've done different kinds of performative or theatrical Brecht. We've worked with Brecht's plays, so it's like, even though it's the first time we've like run a crew and a cast of that size and run a shoot, because it was like 10 consecutive night shoots, like we would shoot from sundown to sun up. So there was, the scale was the biggest we'd ever worked with. We were still drawing on a lot of kind of ways that we've worked in with our other videos,
I mean, one of the ways was also in the film is a little unconventional in some ways, because we bring body knowledge in as a form. So we had this idea that we call it the resistant dead, that there would be a growing feeling through the film of forms of bodily resistance of people who've been killed by state violence who refuse to be forgotten. And so we built a series of performances around real stories and start to insert those into a film, so that in the beginning of the film, they almost become like a haunting aspect, I suppose, or a hauntology. But then they become a sort of more of a circle of solidarity to the women towards the end, where we're thinking about things like ancestral knowledge. And we looked at the manifesto of the Zapatistas, who talk about how almost as revolutionaries, they're already dead, because they carry with them all of the relationships to their ancestral knowledge, families, and resistant bodies inside themselves and their actions in the present tense. So we were thinking about different ways that we could articulate that into this movie. So its structure looks like it starts off as a conventional, so to speak, sort of road movie, we called it, didn't we, in the beginning, together, a feminist road movie, and gradually it starts to psychologically play with its characters.
Those,
and so the characters are trying to cling on to an idea of normal, especially the male characters, as they increasingly we have to ask ourselves what is normal as the film goes forward.
But it was, it was tightly, I mean, there was like, shot lists. We were ambitious, I think we pretty much shot like, everything that we wanted to, even though, you're always up against time. But what Brad's talking about is also, there's a lot of thinking and a lot of research and a lot of theory in the way that we work, but that becomes embodied in play. So we kind of co-create quite interesting bonds with the people that we work with, not just the cast, but crew as well. So like, that's also how we work. So it's not just so much what's on screen. It's like we try and create the conditions under which we can creatively play together. So as we were even shooting, the actors are still like in their craft. So they became even more aware of the kind of directors that we are and what our vision was. So that creative process never really stopped, even to the right end of the shoot, the last moment of the shoot, if you know what I mean.
Okay.
So yeah, it's important to play as well.
Well, and I like the way you play with chronology. It starts out like a chronological story, but then that all is changed, and then back and forth, and then the magic realism elements and other elements come into play. And like I said, I really hope that you people out there will watch the film and in our digital showroom at B3. And now maybe we'll leave it aside and talk a little more in general about your work as artists and as a duo. Your art is very versatile. You do exhibitions, videos, and all kinds of other works. And we've briefly heard Brad describe it in the beginning. What was the seed of the idea for Ruptures? And I imagine that every artwork has this sort of seed of an idea that you come across and that maybe evolves into a work of art. So the question is, where do you find those seeds? And how many of them actually evolve into finished projects and works of art?
That's a good question. I think there's many more seeds, sadly, still in sketchbooks. So I think we're quite generative in terms of ideas and seeds. But usually, what happens is the artworks tend to be like when Brad and I both come together on a seed, because you can have. Sometimes it can take a while for us to sort of see something into the same seed, from a different position. If you know what I mean, because we're two very, very different characters. Our creativity manifests in very different ways. We have different temporalities, different rhythms, but when we all of a sudden, when it clicks, like through the research or discussions or generating, we're always showing, sending fragments. Have you seen this? Have you read that? Have you listened to that track? And then it will be like, oh, okay, this is what we start to realize, something's forming. And then we use like formal things, don't we? Like a very concrete example is having time. So the seed for the Scar and Ruptures came from applying for a residency. And it was a really interesting residency that happened to be in London, and we are Londoners. So to be in residence in your own city is quite unusual, but it was the context of the residency, and it was who was hosting it, which was Delphina Foundation. So what's really, special about those opportunities are they give you time. So it gave us time to really immerse ourselves in these fragments. And by the end of the 3 months, we had come out with a very fully formed project, plus other kind of collaborators that were already on board. So yeah, it's looking for the right conditions in which the seeds can also grow. That's what I feel.
Film London were very important for us in that. And that's very interesting. It goes back to your earlier question about installation and single screen, because the commission from Film London, which was key for us to be able to do that, to do this project, also from the beginning, they were very clear they wanted to see a single screen version. And I'm always grateful to them for that, because it means so many more different people can see the work than the installation, which is a big thing to put on. And just to answer your question about versatility, I mean, the way I've always tried to think about that for myself in the most simple form possible is to ask, well, what does the work need? So if you have an idea and you can ask that simply, what does the work need to make it done? That's why things can flow in so many different directions. It could end up being a collage work. It could end up being a situation. It might not be art. It could be holding a space. So one of the things we talk about is acupuncture and pressure points. And you can't be everywhere. So where are the pressure points where you can be? And they change from situation to situation, city to city. So for years in London, we felt one of the most radical things we could do was hold space for other artists. And we ran a film cooperative for years and years to do that and put events on and to self-educate and to share those processes. But it may be that in different places, different strategies are needed, and that's definitely how we work. Is what does the work need? What are the conditions that are needed for the work to be successful?
And the sort of community around that, because we are in collaboration, but all our work is collaborative, and sometimes it does actually go into sort of collective ways of working. So there's a lot of, like, we co-authored the script for the film. That was, there's three creative souls that have authored that, and it was written in both languages. It was written in Turkish and written in English simultaneously. So it's not like one was written and then it was translated into the other. It's like, no, we were thinking through both languages through the ideas of this story. So how could it be a bicultural, for want of a better word, product that works in both? That isn't just about having it translated, because then there's things that get lost culturally in that translation. So these are the kind of levels of which we are working at and thinking across,
But it sounds to me that you're very inspired by life around you. I mean, some artists, they have more, they look to the inside, and all of their work is autobiographical in one way or another. Now you might say that, okay, as you go through life, everything you experience is sort of autobiographical, but maybe not. I think there is a difference there. And you seem curious about what is around you and very alert. And you mentioned that you read a lot and you cherish exchanging your ideas and opinions with colleagues and friends and other artists. So would you say that, yes, you are more responsive to what goes on around you and finding things that you weren't looking for? Or is there a strong autobiographical note all the same?
Well,
great question. I mean,
we would answer that really differently, wouldn't we?
What?
I think we both answered that question really differently.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I think that there is for me, there's a fingerprint around the autobiographical, which is the vein, the thread is always about these forces of oppression and sort of like power and how power moves and speaks and how it internalized, and so it's quite big massive themes and overarching narratives, but then I think there's also, I think about our, like, the beginnings. We did have two separate practices before we started collaborating, and I think about our practice as initially I feel like we started out asking questions. It was very important. So it was quite more conceptual, political work that was about asking questions, not just of ourselves, but of our situation and of our world. And now I feel like I've actually, it's much more about telling stories. So the storytelling has become more, rather than the conceptual art questions, it's more how to still deal with social issues or these big questions in life about injustice. That's my kind of thing I can't seem to get away from. It's come out, and it's when your question about the world, I think, I'm processing this magical realism of the world. For me, the world is bonkers. It's like, you can't make this stuff up. It's like, it's like, what is it? Truth is stranger than fiction. It's like, you just can't. I'm constantly amazed and appalled at the same time. And so I have to try and make sense of the world.
That's right. Very close to it. I actually wrote down, funny enough, and I know you can't have cheated and looked at what I wrote down because you haven't got your glasses on. But I wrote down, funny enough, on reflection, that this idea that we probably did start off asking questions, and then I would say, just as the middle bit, I think a lot of our work moved into handling conditions. Like, that's why you see us make a museum of non-participation. I think we were trying to make works which would place people into,
or place ourselves.
Well, exactly. Always for us to process the conditions that we were living through, and funny enough, storytelling has come out of that, hasn't it? And so I find myself wonderfully in agreement with Noor's diagnosis of our thinking on that.
What is the museum of? What is that museum of non-participation? You mentioned it already.
Well, there's two ways to tell that story. One is through a story, and the other is through the condition of non-participation. And maybe
do it through the condition of non-participation.
Do you think so?
Yeah.
Okay. So we started to create an umbrella to be able to hold all of these different versatile ways of thinking about two things that we saw in the term non-participation. One is the way that power operates down onto people, and another is the way that resistance structures can operate. And non-participation for us was really interesting because it carries both inside it, certainly in English language for us. So you have non-participation as a withdrawal, as a movement away from something or turning away.
Refusal. Yeah.
But you also have non-participation, which is a different and sometimes more insidious quality. So it's, for example, your decision not to get involved in something, for your decision to not connect how your life might be in fact impacting others, for you not to make a series of connections to do with, I don't know, how we buy and consume things in relationship to global warming or whatever it is for you, or and that non-participation, when we started to diagnose it, and not just us, but through the great thinkers like Judith Butler, wrote an extremely important book called Frames of War. She talked about that non-participation as a forcible frame. So she was talking about forces of power that would help dictate your gaze away from certain things. So why, in her case, she would ask, why is one life more grievable than another? Why could you relate to one person's story and sideline from others? And once you get into that world of complexity about how different forces of resistance and different forces of oppression work and drive through you, you're entering into, for us, and like something which we embody in our lives, the contradictions, the complications, our complicity in systems, our implications in systems, our bodies as colonial subjects, our desire to move away from that. That's very fertile ground to handle, to talk about, to think about, to take a position on, and to make artwork from. And the Museum of Non-Participation was our way of trying to hold that in relationship to our own practice, our questions, our political philosophy, and handling that in relationship to the pressures which come in the art world also, which is full of the same complications and contradictions, many of which you sort of need to work with, and many of which you just don't want to be associated with. So we created a fictional museum. At the same time, we were holding a real space in London, which was our film cooperative called Nowhere. And so we had both at the same time, this physical space with its own challenges, and then this fictional museum that was a collection of our works, constantly provoking ourselves through these difficult conditions, questions. And
wow, I find it quite difficult to grasp this concept.
It's hard to put it in. It's hard to put it into like succinct, but and it was a generative way of, I think, like trying to sort of again bring language to things felt, but like not for us at that time voiced. So, for instance, how do you participate in a system and a structure that you don't actually agree with all its values, but but you still, like, for instance, how do you, for me on a personal level, at that time in 2007 and 8, I was just really like, I wanted to still be an artist and I wanted to make art, but I was really, really fed up with the working conditions of what it meant, like having to do, like, we don't talk about money, or there's so much unpaid work, or, there was just the class kind of element where if you had generational wealth, you could, it was all of these things that was just not being spoken about. It was a very different time in 2007, 8. And, and then we had it's a very different political moment then to what it is now. So it was like, wanting to still participate as an artist, but wanting to withdraw from self-exploitation or exploitative labor. So in a way, I'm not saying it answered those questions, but it was a journey of which to investigate, which at the time also meant that the work of art became negotiating the terms and conditions of participation.
So participation as a choice also that you make.
Well, that's the thing. It's so intersectional, though, isn't it? Because it's like, if you're from a certain background, you have certain privileges or accesses, so it's like the ground isn't level, so the fact that even interrogating the fact that those, actually, to not participate is also a space of privilege in certain contexts, because it means you have the means to withdraw, or you have the means to make that visible, or if you have a platform, your voice then actually has more weight. Like, I've not participated in certain things and it's just hasn't counted, because I didn't have power in that situation for that to be heard. It was trying to get inside all of those really very interlocking, intersectional ways that sort of, I keep talking about power, but the way that things are fundamentally established when value is placed on a transactional or money or financialized, as opposed to the other value systems that are to do with more human and humanizing.
But it's interesting that you chose to found a museum of non-participation, as if it were a space that you could go to. And why not write a manifesto of non-participation? Why a museum?
Yeah, I mean,
it was the ultimate colonial space at the time.
Exactly. Yeah.
You could also say that we were trying. The project was about the heart of empire as well. We were trying to also. It's language now that I wouldn't say you could put on then, but the process and the journey was a process for me, was also of decolonizing my self, my education, my relationships. It's like I've grown up diasporic, but I've grown up as a British subject. I've grown up under the colonial silence, in the sense that none of my education I've been able to access. Only when I've gone as a self-educator, only when I've gone searching for the post-colonial subjectivity, only when I've gone back to being on land, as in the former colonies, so for me, there was a whole process of looking at power in relationship to the Eurocentric colonial mindset, that I've been completely indoctrinated, having grown up in the West. And that's not just coming from a diasporic, all of us growing up that haven't had access to that, to those histories, those herstories, to those voices,
Wow, now it's happening exactly that we're slowly but surely running out of time. I knew this was going to happen, but let me ask you one last question. Since I don't think we can get to the bottom of the Museum of Participation, but maybe some other time. And you've given us a lot of interesting food for thought, that's for sure, already. But what I'd like to ask you as my last question, as an artist duo, and you've already briefly touched on that several times, when you collaborate, how do you manage to find one expression for two different artistic minds? Yeah, and the end there's one without, but the two of them have worked out.
When Noor said earlier on, there's a moment where we often feel in our practice, in a history of our practice, that when the two of us decide on something, And you've got to imagine that's quite a negotiation. It's quite a series of thoughts and processes and sharing. There's a lot of trust that happens there. But when we both decide on something, that's usually the time when something moves forward. That said, underneath your question, I think is something else that we're handling from the inside, which is how do you handle a collaboration where you're both evolving as people? You get older, there's moments when you evolve and move in different directions, you have different interests, you can stand and represent different parts of our practice, and Noor can do that in ways that I can't. That's a very complicated space to continue to negotiate, but somehow in us having to talk that through, rethink it, constantly ask if we're ever going to do a piece of work together again, we're always doing that from the beginning. We never know if there'll be another one. But it's true, isn't it?
Yeah, it's fresh in the way that, I still feel like every piece of work I make with Brad is the last one we're going to do together. And that's not because it's like it's a bad experience. It's just because it's like it's not assumed, It's like we literally started out and made one collaborative film together as students when we were doing our masters, and that was just meant to be that one thing, wasn't it?
But it's also about
and it's turned into like 23 years. So the conversation is still fresh, and collaboration isn't easy. But it's not about us agreeing. There's a lot of conflict, there's a lot of tension, there's a lot of dissonance, but somehow we're still interested in each other's ideas, thought processes, and
there's a lot of trust built up over the years. I trust my intuition, I trust Noor's intuition, and that helps. But also I do trust now, as we're older, that there are ideas that she has which I don't feel, which I would love to see happen in the world. They're just not going to happen with my help, except as background support. So there's this sort of, I'm noticing there's a sort of duo practice, and then there's things like Noor's become a football agent, which I think is amazing, and I love supporting it because I love football, but and I see a way that will become part of our practice with the film projects and things. Yeah. But there's
we bring different things into this collaborative space. We bring very diverse inputs into what could then be. And so, like, that answers your question. Not everything becomes work or artworks, but there is a very, very long, deep, enjoyable conversation, and kinship, friendship. There's deep friendship, and respect. I think respect for each other's creativity. Yeah.
What are you currently working on?
Collages and
we're making we're penning and getting support gradually as it's happening for a science fiction, an intersectional science fiction feature film. By far our biggest project. It comes out of all of these conversations you're hearing. It's a chance
come out of the experience of making The Scar and Ruptures.
And I've had a deep love of science fiction, haven't I, for a crazy long time. So I feel like I've ingested thousands of books over years. So I'm excited just to even just accept that in myself and let it out. And you're finding your way into a pattern of working, which is more like a pyramid structure with this film. Would you say?
No, I mean, I think that every time we do something, it's not like we decide to be change it up or change the form, but somehow the form shifts, So even the way we're working now, the collaboration keeps shifting. So, for instance, give you an example, I went on a trip that I initiated with another artist for research on a project that took me through South Asia, so through Sri Lanka, through India, and through Pakistan last year. Thankfully, I wouldn't be able to do it this year. But I mean, I went on I'm still living. Anyway, that's a different story. But anyway, while I was traveling, working on that, Brad had started to just pick up ideas and things coming out of the back of the film, and started to write a script. So as he said, as long as I've known him, he's been an avid science fiction reader. I mean, he's read so many books, right? But it's never really appeared in our practice. But then when I got back off my trip, kind of presented me with this incredible script, I was like, wow, and amazing. And because it was also seeing like into a part of him that, even though I'd known he'd, had this interest, it never had a form. So it was like an invitation. It was an invitation for me. He's like, well, I've written this, but are you interested? Do you see a part? Do you want to so how do we start to so we're now working with his script in ways that is expansive, and there's at least a future film on a slightly more, again, a bigger scale and more conventional, so it's more like a coming out debut film, feature film. That's what we're trying to sort of ink at the moment.
We look forward to that, and maybe you'll get a chance to present it during the next B3 Biennial. That would be lovely. And unfortunately, we need to wrap this up. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
It's been lovely talking to you. Very interesting. And hope to get to meet you in person, maybe at the next festival. Stay healthy, stay well, stay creative, and all the best to you. And goodbye to our audience.
Thanks, Diana.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.